Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty channel. I'm always excited when I have Carey Griffel back because we always talk about these deep, important theological topics, and she's the right person to discuss about these things, knowing her background and education and all of these things. But Carrie, first, welcome. And can you please tell us something about yourself, especially about your theological background?
Yeah, great. So I run a podcast. It's called Genesis Marks the Spot. And you can find it at all of the streaming places. And I just got a new website up, which I shouldn't be as excited about a website, I feel like, but I just really am because I'm not a tech person. Anyway, so you can find that at genesismarksthespot.com and listen to all of my episodes there and transcripts and all of that jazz. And so I was raised LDS, but now I would call myself a historical biblical Christian. I do have a master's degree in biblical studies, and I just love getting into all of the deep topics of the Bible.
Yeah, I get always slightly jealous towards people who have a higher theological education than me. I'm like, man, that must be amazing. Carrie, tonight we'll be assessing this very vague and very nerdy topic, which is, as I title the topic for tonight, biblical chaos, or how is Yahweh wrestling with chaos. As for those who know more about this topic than me, they know very well that this theme can be traced from Genesis to Revelation. When it comes to this topic of biblical chaos, there is a German word called Chaoskampf, and it means struggle against chaos. The Chaoskampf is an ancient motif from mythology depicting a god. So, as we can see in this sense, it doesn't have to be biblical god. So, there is a god who represents order defeating a serpent, and this serpent can be male or female. It represents chaos in order to gain control over the cosmos. Carrie, when it comes to this topic and this definition which we just read, um, how biblical do you find it to be?
Oh, extremely. And it's extremely interesting because it serves as both a polemic against pagan literature, but it's not just that. I think it's very deeply embedded into the human psyche for various reasons. So you can kind of look at it from scientific perspectives, you can look at it from psychological perspectives, and you can look at it very definitely from biblical perspectives. So I think that all of that is different facets of what we can see in this, because while I prefer looking at the biblical studies and I prefer looking at what the Bible has to say about things, well, all truth is God's truth. So when we see something that is very psychologically embedded in us, like the fear of snakes or the fear of chaotic water, like that's something that's there for a reason, or for probably more than one reason. So I think you can really look at all of those things, but of course we're going to get into the biblical side of things and the ancient Near Eastern side of things, because those two things go hand in hand. And if you only understand it from a biblical perspective, then you're missing out on kind of the depth and the understanding that the original authors and writers and readers would have seen the topic, is in this matrix of ideas that as I like to say. So, yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and I think that a lot of people read Genesis, for instance, and they go, "There's no chaos there. God's not fighting anything," and He is, and He isn't. There's various ways you can look at that, and I think we'll kind of get into this. And I don't know how far we'll get into the topic tonight, but there's lots to talk about.
Yeah, and for those who have been following same scholars with the women following and maybe reading even the same articles and same books. You're familiar with this very late 19th century German scholar called Hermann Gunkel, who wrote in 1895 book on chaos, which is translated in English. It's called Creation and Chaos in the Primeval Era and the Eschaton. In this book, he describes a conflict between Yahweh and Leviathan or Rahab, which is basically described as these ancient serpents in the sea. And Herman taught that Old Testament borrowed from the Babylonian myth. Now, before I mention what some other more modern scholars are saying regarding what he said, so far, are we hitting some important points at the beginning of Genesis 1? Could we say, because you mentioned very well that a lot of Genesis and the Old Testament was written for the sense of being polemical, correcting and defending the faith and correcting it against pagan myths. So when we check Hermann Gunkel's book, and when we see that he used to believe that Old Testament borrowed heavily from Babylonian mythology. What is your theological opinion on this?
Well, he was working with what he had. If you read his work, which was, I forget what year it was fairly recently translated into English, so you can go and read this yourself. He has some really interesting ideas that I definitely don't agree with, especially when he gets to connecting it with Revelation. But it's kind of a difference in the way you're interpreting and thinking about things. The reason that we bring up the term Chaoskampf, which is the German term for what we're talking about, like the reason you have that German term is that a lot of our theology is still very embedded in the scholarship of Germany, who kind of led the way in the 18th century for a lot of these ideas. So you can get his book, and a lot of it is still really relevant to the study. But he didn't have all of the information we have today. So what he had fairly recently in his time were discovered the Babylonian myths. And there are very much those parallels between the Bible and the myths of Babylon. And of course, when you think about Babylon in the chronology of time in its relationship to Israel, what we're thinking of is the time of the exile, basically. Just before that and just after that, and all around there. So that's kind of a bit late, but so what he had was that kind of material. In 1928, they found a whole slew of texts from Ugarit, which is in Canaan. So that's a city that's north of Israel, and they have the myth there too. So this is not the stuff that Hermann Gunkel was working with. He didn't know anything about all of those kinds of texts. So it's and I think that the fact that we see the theme and those texts from Ugarit are demonstrably earlier because of the time periods that they lived in and the time periods that they reigned in. So we have the myth that goes from that time all the way up to the exile. So it's very much a long distance kind of an idea that really lasted the test of time. So I wouldn't just toss out his ideas and his scholarship willy-nilly because it's very much connected. But we need to realize that we're always learning more, and we're always seeing that, oh, what we had before wasn't the whole picture. So I definitely still recommend reading it if you're interested in this topic. Like I said, once he gets to Revelation, he has some really weird ideas of the provenance of Revelation, but in any case, you can definitely dig into his Old Testament studies and really see a lot of the connections that we would still be making today with the theme of chaos.
Yeah, thank you for that. For today's topic, I'm just telling this to our viewers, I had to assess several different books coming more from contemporary scholars who came way after this German scholar, and who have their own input backed up by later data, like you're saying, and they had different thoughts than Hermann Gunkel. For example, David Tsumura. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He thought that Tehom in Genesis 1 2, and by the way, Genesis 1 2 will be our main passage for tonight. So, David Tsumura taught that Tehom in Genesis 1 2 derived from Tiamat, which is the Babylonian goddess of the primeval ocean. Some later scholars doubted that. Tehom means ocean or water. According to John Day, who is a fine scholar, but I would say probably less conservative than Tsumura, because their ideas, at least according to both books which I read for today, their ideas clash in some cases. So, according to John Day, modern scholarly consensus says that it was the Canaanite and not the Babylonian mythology that inspired the Old Testament conflict between Yahweh and the dragon. Is this something that you would agree with, Carey? Because according to John Day's book, it seems every chapter is filled with these examples how the Canaanite mythology is actually a better source for this topic of Chaoskampf in the Old Testament, much better than Babylonian.
Well, like I said, it tends to be earlier. Because the time when Babylon was really prominent, it was quite late. It was during and before the exile. So, so yeah, the ideas are earlier than this, but you see the same kinds of ideas in Egypt. You see the same ideas like in every civilization around there. You would have some sort of idea of the chaos and the chaos beast, usually associated with water or the underground or all of these things that we're going to be getting into. So I think that trying to pin down an idea of where it all started, I'm not sure that's really the most fruitful way to approach the topic. Rather, you should be looking at all of these places where it shows up and what do they individually do with the topic. Because each area of time and space will have its own unique twist on the idea or ideas that it's bringing to the table. So I think that's how we should look at it. And like, if you listen to my podcast, I do try and get into some of the information about figuring out the date of Genesis. Is it Mesopotamian? Does it have an Egyptian core? Is it mostly Canaan? All of those, and you see all of it. So I think trying to parse it out and draw out all of these things that specifically, I think that's a bit misguided. And that's kind of what scholars like Gunkel in the 1800s were doing, is they were trying to pick apart the text and say, oh, this part talks about Leviathan, so we're going to ascribe it for this time. And this text over here only mentions sea dragons, so it's talking about this, it's from this time. And this text over here is only talking about the water without personification of a being. And so they're going to strip all of those ideas out and assign those to different time periods. And to some degree, that might be valid, but it's also the case that we had redactors throughout the Bible, we had editors, we had people who compiled things. So it's the same kind of idea of trying to pick apart the text of this was from the priestly writer and this was from the Yahwehist writer and all of that. Like, it's kind of helpful to point out some ideas, but you get into this like, where does that stop? Like, how far do you go? It's not just 4 writers. Now suddenly we have 15 writers, and it's like, well, okay, slow down there. We can't go too fast and furious with that, because like, what is that even going to do for us in the end? We should be reading it as a whole and seeing the themes as well. So there's kind of that, yeah, it's helpful, but how much can you do with it? You're always going to find people who are going to argue. And I don't know. It's just going to be based on their personal like their framework of how they're approaching the text. Like if they think the text was written by all of these different authors, or whether it was a little more broad and fuzzy than that. So, yeah.
Yeah, before we start dissecting chaos, I just wanted to read Genesis 1 2 for all of the viewers because it's a very short verse and it's the core verse of today's episode and the next one because I don't think we'll finish everything today. Okay, so Genesis 1 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Okay. One of the chaos synonyms that I drew from all these scholars are without form, void, darkness, the deep, and I believe we can easily put here the abyss, the waters, the sea, Rahab or Leviathan, and the great sea creatures. Uh, would you agree or not that these are good synonyms? And is there anything more to this lengthy list that can help us understand chaos better? Because in order to understand something or even form a doctrine, as we know, for example, like with the Trinity, there does not have to be necessarily a word in the Trinity. Well, this is the Trinity. Let me explain it to you. Rather, we compile words, similar teachings from the whole Bible when we form all these doctrines. So, what is there any is there anything else that we can add when it comes to this topic and this phrase? Any other synonym that can resemble the word, maybe even in a better way?
Yeah, so usually you're associating chaos with the sea dragon and the waters, which I think that is primarily kind of our go-to ideas. But you can also loop in the idea of wilderness, because the idea of wilderness is very similar to the idea of how they would be viewing the waters, as these places are, you can't live there, they're not good for life. And so I think that's also an idea that we need to be pulling in. And you can also kind of see in these ideas the cosmological structure of the ancient world, right? They had the heavens, they had the earth, they had the underworld, but the underworld was also associated with the deep, the abyss, the chaotic waters of the sea. And in Genesis, you actually don't see God declaring anything good until he separates the sea from away from the land. Then finally something is declared as good. So it's really these little subtle things. Like you could read Genesis 1 and say, I don't see chaos in there at all, or I barely see it, and it's kind of a sideline. It's not important, but I would beg to disagree with that. I think it's very important, and I think it's very deeply embedded. But because it's so deeply embedded in the imagery and the thinking, we're not going to necessarily pick up what they're laying down when we read from these authors.
Yeah, yeah, all good stuff. Well, let's start dissecting one of these, terms. Before I read something from another scholar, how about we start with waters? Waters representing chaos throughout the Bible. Not waters not being mentioned. Well, actually, the sea not being mentioned in Revelation, but we see this whole theme, the whole line of theme we see from Genesis to Revelation. And as much as I'm familiar with this topic, and I know that you know more, waters were not just in ancient Israel, but in the whole ancient Near East world and their worldview. These turbulent waters were almost like well, not almost. They had a meaning as something evil and problematic. So let's please first start with waters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would distinguish the type of water we're talking about, because water is not always evil in the Bible. It's not always a negative thing. especially like look into the New Testament, it's so easy to see. We have the theme of living water. What does that mean? Like, how is that different from the chaos waters? And so you have in the ancient world, they would have, just like we have a distinction between salt water and fresh water. Fresh water grants life, and salt water is not good for life, or that tends to be where the massive amount of water is that you have to try and cross if you're trying to go somewhere far or whatever like that. So there's that distinction between living water, fresh water, and seawater. And you see that that's part of the Babylonian account of creation, Enuma Elish, where Tiamat, the sea dragon, the chaos monster, is split into two. And there's also the heavens and the earthly water, like the water above and the water below. So water isn't always negative. Like the waters in the heavens is not going to be seen as something that's like the chaos waters, but the waters below are definitely going to be seen as that. And like I said, we have the idea of the cosmology of the time where you might have seen pictures of the three-tiered universe of the ancient Near East, and the Earth sitting on top of the the great deep, and that's also where Sheol is. So you have to be connecting all of these mentally, or else you're going to be missing the complete picture that the original audience would have had in their minds. So yeah, it's a really interesting thing. And when you think about the time that they lived and the fact that they were a very agrarian society and water was absolutely necessary to life, but it could also kill you. So, and of course, you have the flooding of the Nile. And if we take the fact that the Israelites were in Egypt for so long, the Nile would, and the image of the Nile would still be prominently in their minds in some areas of their uh, national life. So the flooding of the land was absolutely necessary, but it could also be devastating if it came at the wrong time. So, yeah, it's very interesting to try and piece out these little subtleties of it as well, because we tend to just broad brush the whole thing and say, oh, look, there's water, that must be evil. Not necessarily. And I would say the same about the serpent, because you have the serpent in Genesis, but you also have Moses who is lifting up the serpent staff in the wilderness to heal the people. He's not lifting up chaos to heal people there. So that's going to be different. So you really have to just, yeah, there's hyperlinks, but you need to make more than one connection. And that's why you need to see the theme as a whole.
Yeah, thank you for that detailed explanation. I just wanted to read like a short passage summarized by another theologian, Michael Morales. Basically, water is often a symbol of chaos. Deep rivers, seas, and oceans are places people cannot live. Sheol, which in the Old Testament is better understood as the underworld and not so much as hell. So Sheol, and in particular the abyss, are described as watery places. Egypt also is described like Sheol. One would descend down into Egypt, and the Exodus was an ascension. Exile is a symbolic death. In this sense, we can think of water images, Egypt and Sheol as related. Further, in several passages, Pharaoh is described as a dragon or serpent. Aaron's staff turns into a serpent more than once, Exodus 7. Hebrew words used here are both nekash and tanin. These words could be translated serpent, dragon, or sea monster depending on context. In a sense, Moses and Aaron bring a serpent to meet a serpent or dragon to meet a dragon. Sounds like those 70s and 80s kung fu movies. In a good way. In a good way. This is very interesting, given that Exodus 7:15 describes Pharaoh going quote unquote out of the water. And I want to thank our ministry partner, Paul Ali, who actually wrote a paper on this and sent me this info. But what is your theological opinion about not just going from waters, now going then to abyss and the pit, to all the way to the Pharaoh, the serpents and dragons. This seems as a short paragraph that is packed so much theologically, and I believe it's very important for us.
Definitely. And there's, and of course, when you look at the story of Israel and Israel as a nation, there's nothing more important to their national heritage than the Exodus, right? That's like you have Abraham who founded the nation, you have the patriarchs, but it's the Exodus that really defines Israel as a people in terms of, look, we were a people, we screwed up and bad things happened, and it wasn't just us who did that. There are also dark forces in the world who are against us. You have the nation of Israel, or the nation of Egypt. You have the leader of Egypt, Pharaoh, and you have the gods of Egypt who are actively trying to go against Yahweh. So all of those things combined is that's what you have with the Exodus story and the going through the waters there. So not only do you have the chaos waters here, but we see God controlling the chaos waters, and we see God using them to purify Israel as they're going through the waters, not actually being touched by the chaos waters, but the same idea of being rescued through the waters, depending on various translations. That's what you see in the flood, and that's what you see in the Exodus, and that's what you see when the New Testament writers talk about baptism as well. They're making that connection. Well, it's like, well, when you go and get baptized, you're not usually going into the actual ocean or sea. Some people do. A lot of us don't have access to that, so we don't, or we don't want to. But it doesn't matter what kind of water you're being baptized into. The symbolism is there. You are being rescued, and the water is a part of that deliverance imagery, and also cleansing as well. So it's like, how do you get deliverance from chaotic waters and also being cleansed by those same waters? That's a strange idea because it seems so opposite to us, but that's, God can do that. that that's how you get polemics and all of that.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to read one comment by our brother Joseph Brown, whom I don't know, but I welcome you, Joseph, and I welcome these wise, knowledgeable inputs. He said that the home slash the deep is even at times a good thing. Genesis 49:25, and Joseph being blessed by Jacob with blessings of the home slash the deep. So I wouldn't say I disagree with Joseph on this one.
Right. Yeah, because Joseph is seen to go into the pit. Well, he's thrown into the pit by his brothers. And then when he's in Egypt as well, he goes into prison, which is another figure for the pit. And he comes out as the deliverer of Egypt and the world through the famine and all of that. So, yeah, it's this idea of it's chaotic, but God's using it for his purposes. Like that's not the kind of thing that you see in any pagan literature. So it's very unique to the Bible, as far as I know, anyway.
Yeah, and later we will be talking a little bit about how God is actually the one who is controlling and creating chaos. So this is not something, even though I love fantasy and love sci-fi, and trust me, I would love with those gazillion O's between L and V. I would love to see one of those Marvel movies or novels where there is this chaotic force or even a deity fighting with Yahweh and Yahweh slashing the Leviathan with a sword, like it says in Psalms. But unfortunately or not, we don't see this. We see God from the beginning until the end creating everything and subduing everything. But back to the very terminology of chaos. Chaos, like we said, it's all can also mean without form or void, which I would leave to the next section of the of the episode when we were dissecting Genesis 1, and when we go with tohu and vabohu, these Hebrew terms. But another synonyms when it comes to chaos would be Leviathan or Rahab. Sometimes they're mentioned as two separate sea serpents. Sometimes they're found to be the same creature, but given with two different names, assessed by different scholars. Basically, pagan Leviathan, because Leviathan was not specifically just a Jewish serpent. It was also used just by a different term. It was used among the pagans as well. So the pagan Leviathan was a sea monster that inhabited the deep chaotic waters. But biblical Leviathan was the personification of the sea dragon. So we can see this difference, even though Leviathan was, it was this giving these enormous problems to the ancient people. But unlike the pagan view, which was just this, monster, uh, for Jews, it was more like a personal problem, more it wasn't just some distant creature like Kraken for Vikings or something like that. So you don't encounter Kraken unless you're a sailor, right? But for the Jews, it seemed as this was more personal in their life. Would you agree with this assessment?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're talking about and where and how people are thinking about it. Like I said, I think that you do see differences in the way the Bible uses metaphors and figurative language. And that makes sense because different people at different times they're going to have different imagery in their lives, right? I actually think that you have people who argue, is Leviathan a real creature? Is he not a real creature? And I think you're missing the point when you're going to those kinds of discussions. But I do think Leviathan, the imagery to a lot of ancient people, uh, ancient Israelites, would have been probably like the crocodile, because crocodiles in Egypt would get huge, and you don't want to be down by the water when a crocodile is there. Like, they really can be dangerous. Like, we have this distance from nature today that people, at least in the modern West, we do. And we don't realize that you really could go down to the water and get killed by a crocodile. That was a danger. That was something that happened. Probably not that infrequently. So, and the fact that you could assign it to the a crocodile, that doesn't take away its mythological proportions or its connections to mythological beasts, or however you want to look at that. Because you can't have an idea of a mythological beast without experiencing something in life. Like, what there's reasons that a lot of our mythological beasts are parts of different animals, right? You bring together two different beasts to create a new beast. And so crocodiles don't breathe fire, but Leviathan is said to be breathing fire. He's also said to have multiple heads, and crocodiles don't tend to have multiple heads. So you're taking an idea that people know and they have experience with on a regular basis, something that they actually fear in a practical way, and you're expanding that to show theological purposes behind that. So, just because we could say that Leviathan is like a crocodile, he's not just a crocodile, okay? We're not just talking about a natural beast here. We're talking about something much broader and more nuanced and more faceted than that. So,
Yeah, when you were talking about multiple heads, I was immediately thinking about Hydra, this Greek mythological being with multiple heads. But also, when you were mentioning the size of a crocodile, I was thinking, wait, are you saying that these monsters are not as big as those in Pacific Rim? Like they're like size of Godzilla? Because I want them to be. I want some epic clash so we can just do like this in the end of times and watch how God is destroying this huge animal. I know I'm just messing up, but
No,
When it
I
comes,
mean I do think that Godzilla is one of these chaos beasts. He comes from the sea. He destroys. I think he's right in line with all of it. I love Godzilla.
yeah, but Godzilla can be a good guy, right?
Yeah, yeah. Just like God in Job, he takes Leviathan and he hooks him, and now he's a pet.
Hmm.
And we have sea monsters that play with the ships like the rubber duckies. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we have to eat something at the end times, right? The big feast at the end.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we will talk about the feast at the end of times in the eschaton. It's so interesting topic. Okay, I just wanted to mention one more thing about Leviathan, that Rahab, who is another sea creature, is a synonym for Leviathan, and in it it means disorderly, loud or noisy or mischievous being. It's a personified raging sea, as well as another personification of chaos as Leviathan. And it's also interesting to me how we have a woman character named Rahab. So sometimes people, if uh, unless they know what they're talking about, they may make a mistake. Could there be something that, you know, how I won't even go into theology of people who are like, oh, that's the spirit of Jezebel. But can we make some conclusion that in the same way as if, hey, in a certain type of monster, let's say in this way it's Rahab or Leviathan, and we see certain evil characteristics which will be displayed in human characters, so that's why we tend to call them according to these monsters. Can that be also parallel also with Jezebel or any of these things, that according to something demonic or chaotic, we tend to give, if we see the same evil or negative characteristics, we tend to portray them on people. I did not even think about talking about this, but it just crossed my mind now. I'm like, okay, this will be interesting to ask Carey.
Mhm. Yeah, because again, it is a matrix of ideas. You have, so we're talking about sea dragons and sea monsters here, but we could also be talking about the beasts of the wilderness. And you have like Lilith, who is connected to like owls and things like that. So there's like this mystery of some sort of female demon who wants to destroy humans. Uh, and you could go lots of places looking into mythology with that. And that's not to say that we can make a taxonomy of all of these creatures. I mean, people try to do that a lot, and I think it's misguided because different people are using different imagery. They're using different words. They're not trying to give us a list of the things that live in the spiritual realm. They're just using these words and these terms and these ideas. Not that they don't have a legitimate connection to the spiritual realm and real beings, but if we're trying to get into the nitty gritty and trying to make a little encyclopedia of it all and say that we know exactly what's going on in that spiritual realm, I think that's misguided and not the direction we should be looking at. Not that you can't look at those things. I'm not saying that it's pointless, but I'm saying that that's you're missing the point there. If you're seeing multiple themes or multiple keywords and multiple types of imagery in one place that is also seen in another place, that's where you can make those hyperlinks. And that's where you can be thinking that maybe the author and the readers would have been making those same connections. So yeah, I think that it's really, we like the idea of the sea dragon. It's such a cool image, right? And when we think about owls, we're like, well, owls are cool, but they're not as interesting as a sea dragon. But the idea of the wilderness and being cast out of civilization so that you no longer can survive the way that you're used to surviving, that's a terrifying thing. Whether that's going out on the ocean in a boat or going out in the wilderness on your own and trying to survive there, trying to find food, trying to find water you can actually drink, trying to deal with beasts that you're not familiar with and that are not tame in any way. So, yeah, I think that all of these ideas kind of cross over in very important ways when we should be building our kind of vocabulary and our mental imagery of reading the Bible.
Yeah, good stuff. Thank you for that. Carrie, when well, basically my second episode ever when I started the channel like 4 months ago was with you, when we discussed. It was one of my favorite topics and favorite episodes so far, because I believe it was very biblical, very sound, and very apologetic. When we were dissecting Yahweh, biblical God, versus all these pagan deities. So one of the things that we discussed in that episode was how, yes, there are similarities between Old Testament and pagan accounts, but there are like vast, huge differences in creation, in the accounts of flood, so many things, the way pagan gods behave, their attributes, how they are so, if I can put, small in a way, or act like humans. They're petty, they have so many issues. Um, they don't seem to be self-sufficient. If you would compare their attributes to Yahweh, they don't seem to be alike at all. Uh, and for today, when we are drawing parallels and similarities with pagan written narratives, for the sake of polemics, when it comes to this topic of chaos, we have, as I mentioned, two accounts. We have Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish, where Marduk battles the ocean goddess Tiamat, and we have this Ugaritic or Canaanite account where Baal fights Yum, goddess Yum. Uh, Without going in deep length or in great length, what can we say about these two accounts? How do they match or differ when it comes to the biblical account of creation, especially when it comes to Genesis 1 2?
Well, obviously, in the Babylonian account, as well as the account with Baal, you have two deities who are fighting. And they're not, neither one of them is the top deity. Neither one of them is the actual sovereign creator. So it's very fascinating to me how, in most of the pagan literature, almost all of the pagan literature at the time, the supreme god took a back seat to everything. It's really interesting how you have the different people groups who would kind of claim a certain deity, right? So they would conquer a territory or something, and they'd put up their deity there, or and their deities weren't all that jealous of one another. Like, you could worship multiple deities because they were over different areas and they would give you different things, and they weren't necessarily jealous. Like, you can't worship other deities, whereas Yahweh is like that. So that's a very different thing when you come to the Bible and you see that Yahweh is a jealous God. That doesn't mean he is some sort of, he's got a negative personal trait. It means that he is the ultimate supreme deity who deserves the worship. Compared to the other places who worshipped lesser deities, they weren't even trying to worship the supreme creator because they didn't think they could get something out of him. I don't know. But there's an idea that there were territorial deities, right? So you wanted to worship the territorial deity of your area. You also wanted to worship the deities who were over the crops, the deities who could give you fertility, the deities who could do all of these particular things. So there was a slew of other deities who would grant you some very specific blessings, and you had to petition that deity in order to get those blessings. So there's a very different flavor to all of that. It's like what Babylon was interested in is why Marduk was their national deity. Marduk wasn't the ultimate creator. Same thing with the area of Canaan. Baal wasn't the ultimate creator, but that's the one they were worshiping. So this story is showing how that particular god that they were worshiping got into power. And he did so by fighting other deities. And usually it was this Chaoskampf theme of the fighting of the sea and the taming of that. And the reason for that is because what they needed in order to found their civilization and to keep their civilization going were crops. You had to have people alive by eating. so, so in order to create a city, you had to have crops that were sustaining that city, and that was very dependent on the weather and the seasons and all of that. And those there were particular deities who were over those. So that was kind of the center on that. But when you're looking at the story of Genesis 1, that's not the story of Genesis 1. It's just not. It, I don't think that Genesis 1 is talking about creation out of nothing, not because God didn't create everything out of nothing, but because they weren't thinking in terms of that. What Genesis 1 is talking about is the sovereign God of all creation who is ordering the entire cosmos. That's what Genesis 1 is about. It's not about how did we get to worship our ultimate deity. It was much broader than that, which was super unique because mostly they were just concerned about themselves and their own civilizations and their own kingdoms and care about the rest of the world. So the Bible's very different from that. And you don't have the personification of God versus chaos. Now, I don't think that means you don't see chaos there, because I think you do. I think chaos is seen in very particular ways, but it's very different.
Thank you for that. Um, I wanted to read a couple of things that seemingly agree when it comes to the biblical account of chaos and pagan narratives, and also then I wanted to mention some differences. But before I do that, I was just thinking about when you said that in some of these pagan accounts, the highest deity, we can call him El, which was a generic name in the ancient world for God. It's not just that word was not, or noun was not just used in the Bible. It was a general name for the highest God. So let's call him El or El Elyon. However, we want to call him this highest deity in the pagan narratives. Like you said, seems to either not exist or being absent. That unfortunately uh, reminds me of something we learn in systematic theology, this God of deism, the God who maybe, just maybe long ago, he was involved in, in creation. Then he stepped back. He has no relationship with creation. He doesn't care. He doesn't love them. He's not considered to be their father in that personal relationship with them. Maybe he made them, but that's it. He's almost like a biological father who deserts his children, unfortunately. So when you were talking about this deity who could be there or could not be there, but even if he or it is there, it seems so distant and not involved and not interested in anything. And I just think that, well, I don't think I can tell clearly, both from the Bible and from personal life, that Yahweh is nothing like that. When it comes to these few similarities between the Old Testament chaos and pagan chaos, I wanted to mention Psalms like 74, 93, and 29, which we cannot read because these are whole Psalms. They associate Chaoskampf with Yahweh's kingship the same way like Canaanite or Ugaritic Baal's victory over Yam, the goddess Yam, or Babylonian Marduk's kinship with his overcoming of Tiamat. This is according to John Day. Another similarity would be that Leviathan was a dragon that accompanied Yam, so it was like a pet to this goddess Yam. We can also see that Baal also defeated Leviathan the same way as Yahweh defeats Leviathan. So these are just similarities, right? We also can tell that Elohim, so the biblical Elohim, and El, when it comes to the Canaanite or the Ugaritic account, are both supreme gods of creation who had a close relationship with the waters. This is according to David Tsumura. So when it comes to these similarities, how much do you think they're tightly connected or necessarily borrowing from each other compared to or versus well maybe they had some similar stories. They were like oral traditions written much later, but they originated maybe from the same region.
Yeah, this connects to what we were talking about earlier about if you can take all of these texts and kind of pick them apart and say, this was written here, and this came from there, and this was from this writer. Uh, and like I said, these themes are so broad that it's really hard to really even say, well, it, people love to say the Bible stole from these other writers, but you see how broad this topic was. And if you look at the texts from the ancient world, if you're able to actually line up the tablets and all of the things that we have the same story in slightly different ways again and again and again and again. So their idea of how writing worked and the purpose of texts was very different from ours. In our world today, if you are a writer, you want to write something original. You want to have something that people have never read before. And you're really mad if somebody takes your idea that you already had first. That's called plagiarism. That's in our world. And they had that during the time of Jesus to some degree. You actually have people talking about plagiarism and stealing ideas. But that was a very kind of new idea. That's not how we see ancient texts, or at least we have zero evidence of anybody talking about, hey, you stole my idea. Why did you do that? That was my idea. No, it was like this whole matrix of ideas that just kind of went along, and your originality to the story would have been connected to your particular circumstance. Like kings would commission new writing because they wanted to have themselves in this story. So we do have letters from kings and between kings and writers or scribes and things saying commissioning these kinds of stories. But they weren't just making up the stories whole cloth. They would be taking the same ideas that everybody was already used to and repurposing those same ideas. If you read the Baal cycle and you read Enuma Elish, there is so much similarity, but I don't hear anybody talking, oh, those Babylonians, they stole that idea. Or if you read the different versions of the Gilgamesh epic, like there's slight variations every time. And is that because they couldn't quite get their story together? They couldn't quite just get it right? No, it's because they were okay with some changes. And those changes probably had very particular meaning to the people at the time. So it's trying to say that somebody stole things from somebody, and that's just the wrong way to look at it. You need to be embedding yourself in this framework that these were the ideas you just took for granted. Everybody thought this way. Everybody believed in this theme of chaos and the idea that you go out into the world and it's dangerous. You come back into civilization and it's nice and neat and ordered, or at least it should be. And why was it nice and neat and ordered? Because the king made it that way. That's how they were thinking. So this is what we are seeing in the Bible, but we don't see that God has to defeat anyone in particular in order to get his order accomplished. Now, that being said, I think you can look at it a little more subtly than that, and I just did in my last podcast episode, and I'm going to continue looking at that theme because I think that the way God works is he doesn't just do everything himself. Like the gods of the pagan nations they would want people to serve people. That's why they made people, or at least that's what their stories say. They made people so that people would serve them. And so there's this kind of idea that humans are only good for the gods as long as the gods are getting use out of us. That's not the relationship God has with humanity at all. And that's what we see in the biblical narrative. But at the same time, God loves participating with humanity. He wants to loop us into what He's doing. And so He's not, we're not just chess pieces on a board. He's not just directing us exactly and saying, okay, you go over there because I want that right now. And you go over there because that's what I want now. So because He's using us, then we are looped into the idea of what does that mean about chaos and the world. So
Yeah, I remember reading for our first episode some of the pagan accounts, and man, their gods are a mess. I have to say this, and I mean it's true because people were created just to serve as a labor, and God forbid they were too loud, because if they were too loud, well then the flood would come and just destroy them. So if that's not a definition of having no rights and being a slave, I don't know what is the better definition. So I just mentioned a few similarities between the biblical chaos and the pagan chaos, but according to this scholar, David Tsumura, however, it was El, not Baal, who was the quote unquote creator god par excellence in Ugaritic mythology. Like you said, there was this maybe vague deity, or the deity that was distant, not too much involved. We don't know too much about him or it. So Tsumura agrees with you. He also says that in Ugaritic, the Baal Yam conflict is not related to the primordial struggle in connection with the creation at all. So it's not the same narrative as Genesis account. And I love how you mentioned twice that yeah, we can just flip the pages of the Old Testament and just point to some page. Oh, this is taken from this place. This is taken from this myth. This is taken from this. Case closed. This is garbage. I don't want to deal with it. But the truth is much more complex, and it takes much more time to study, comparing, deciphering. Just because A, B, and C here and A, B, C over there may sound similar, actually their structure, their purpose, their meaning, their depth could be way different. And unless you go that deep, you cannot just discard something because it's just an argument from ignorance, I would say.
yeah,
Okay.
I mean,
Mhm.
it's like we can't just say that the Japanese stole the idea of Godzilla from the Bible. Like nobody says that, but clearly the themes are so related. And you have the idea of during the time of exploration when people were out exploring the sea, you can look at any of those old maps and see the dragons that are at the edge of the map, and they're getting the same ideas from this whole thing. So it's very it's very silly to me, in my opinion, to just focus and zoom in on this idea. Oh, the Bible isn't completely and utterly and absolutely original, therefore we can just toss it out. That's entirely the wrong way to look at it.
Yeah, all these mythological, chaotic, evil monsters slash beings remind me of Cthulhu. I would love one day to do an episode of Cthulhu and some other cosmic evil slash gods, and there will be another idea for a novel or a movie would be again God defeating this chaotic, enormous, giant deity that comes and just causes chaos with just one of his tentacles. He can cause like the whole tsunami, and then no one can conquer Cthulhu except God. So yeah, I can imagine this would be amazing. Um, Another similarity, which may seem similar, I mean, which may seem the same, it's not the same, but there's still similarities, would be when it comes to this eschatological feast or banquet, where Yahweh in Isaiah 25 is having Leviathan devoured. And this is very interesting because in my research, um, this is not just mentioned in Isaiah 25, but it's also mentioned elsewhere in Apocrypha, like 2 Esdras 6:52, 2nd Baruch 29:4, 1st Enoch 60:24. So why am I mentioning this Apocrypha? Well, of course, they're not parts of the Bible, but still, how deeply embedded was this in the Jewish culture and tradition and belief that, hey, we are patiently expecting deliverance, not just from our human enemies, but from this, if I can put it, quote unquote, cosmic evil, this chaos where God is coming and killing Leviathan. Now, what is Leviathan representing? Is it just a monster like a crocodile, or is it, or even something in a spiritual sense can represent like a deity, like a fallen one? I don't know, but for them, certainly it was important, this very topic, maybe in this encouraging way where they would just share this with each other and encouraging the coming generations to prevail because the help is coming. And in that sense, I think this is beautiful as well as important because it only supports what the Bible says, that God will slay the Leviathan one day. Um, so we can say, yeah, these things are borrowed from Baal's victory over the, chaotic sea and monsters. However, this is not completely the same narrative. Or another example is Yahweh swallowing up death, which is mentioned in again in Isaiah 25. So in the same chapter of Isaiah 25, there's this eschatological feast or banquet, and also we see Yahweh swallowing up death. So this can also, someone may say, like John Day, you know, scholars like him can say, well, this was also borrowed from Baal because in the Baal narrative, he's winning over this god of death called Mot, M-O-T. So yeah, we can see some striking resemblances. How can we? I'm not saying we should even try to reconcile, but what are your thoughts about these very interesting similarities when it comes to this eschatological banquet and also God devouring death in the same fashion as Baal is devouring their pagan god of death?
Yeah, I think we do have to connect it to that eschatological ideas. And as we're talking about this, as I'm thinking about the theme, and I'm thinking about water. So I personally do not like water. I don't like swimming. Don't put me in the ocean. I don't like any of that. But I know a lot of people do. And they're like, well, what are we going to do? Revelation says there's no sea. How am I going to go surfing or whatever it is you like to do? You're missing the point of that. Uh, what's really fascinating to me is this question of we see chaos and we think of it as something that's evil. We think of it as sinful and the enemy of God, and it is. But what about the chaos of the natural world that we experience daily? Like the ancient Israelite would have seen a flood or a, a massive thunderstorm with, destruction or tornadoes. They would have seen those things as chaos. Now, they don't. All right, I should kind of put some brakes on here. Maybe they happen because of sin and judgment, right? I'm not taking that off the table, but I would say that they're probably not always happening because of sin and judgment. Because if that was the case, God would probably let us know what's going on or whatever, right? So we have chaos that happens in the natural world, just seemingly as part of the natural order. And those things aren't even always bad, even in nature. Like if you have a forest fire, it's going to be evil if it takes out a village or some houses. We're going to categorize it as in that kind of a thing. But if the forest never has a forest fire, that is bad for the forest. A fire does good things in the natural order of things. And so, like, what do we do with that kind of chaos? What do we do with the fact that the sea has to be chaotic in order for the sea creatures to live in the way that they do? Like, the sea needs to be churned up. If it's not, bad things happen in the natural order of things. So we have chaos as this evil and we want it defeated, and yet there's this idea that it also has purposes that could advance what creation needs to do in the world. And so, like, if we're thinking of this very strict dichotomy of chaos has to mean evil and it's the exact same thing, then I think we're going to miss out on how should we think about the lack of sea in Revelation? What does that mean? Can we no longer take our jet skis out there and have fun? Like, and are all of the whales going to die? Why did God even create whales? And why did he create starfish? And why did he create all, like, there is a massive amount of amazing animals that live in the ocean. And the ocean gives us a whole lot of our oxygen as well. So how's that going to work? So it's like, but how do you tame that into not being something that ends up destructive to life in general in a bad way? And when we're talking about that, we're usually talking about humanity because, like it or not, we are the pinnacle of creation. So it's not that we can't feel bad when the deer die in the forest fire, because certainly we are supposed to have some empathy for all of God's creatures. But what is the order of creation and what is the purpose of all of that? And I think that if we loop into the idea, if we loop in all of creation into the concept of chaos and what that looks like as far as our connection to it, then suddenly we're looking at our earthly dominion, the dominion mandate that we have in Genesis 1, where we are supposed to be caring for creation and helping it be as ordered as God wants it to be. So I think that is also part of the chaos. Like, how do we see our role in that? And what does that mean for the eschaton? Like, because the Bible never says that we die and just go to heaven and sing on clouds for the rest of eternity. Like, it talks about a new heavens and a new earth. So, and we are physical creatures still. We're given new physical bodies. So with all of that, it's like, well, maybe there's something about chaos and that is involved in humanity and our goal as imagers of God.
Yeah, I was thinking it would be a good time to transit to another meaning of chaos, which we mentioned earlier when it comes to Genesis 1, 2, and those terms, tohu and vabohu. But when we see the whole first chapter of Genesis, we can see differences compared to the pagan accounts. For example, God doesn't struggle with the forces of chaos, right? uh, for those who would think there is, it is only assumed. There is no firm evidence that God is fighting and wrestling with forces of chaos. Again, I wouldn't mind because it sounds like an amazing plot. Give me popcorn and I'll watch that kind of movie, but we don't see that. Second thing, we don't see that chaos is God. We don't see chaos being divine at all in the same fashion as in pagan accounts. Also, primordial waters are not personified, right? They're just waters. They're not, um, again, some deities, like, for example, Yam would be this serpent in the pagan literature. Okay. So when it comes to Genesis 1, 2, and dilemma regarding this topic of Chaoskampf or primeval chaos, let's dissect Tohu and Bohu. What is Tohu and what is Bohu? Not just translated directly from Hebrew, but also in their own context.
So the other place that we actually see this is in Jeremiah, where the context there is the judgment and exile. So the idea of tohu va bohu, which is the Hebrew terms underlying our English translations in Genesis 2, you have a combination of ideas here. You have the idea of emptiness, and you have the idea of a wilderness where, so the emptiness is there's nothing there. Like there's no beings, there's there's no life there at all. Whereas the idea of wilderness is there's something there, but it's not conducive to life yet. And I think these two terms connect to the structure of the days of creation. We have the first 3 days of creation where God is structuring the environments. So he's fixing the problem of tohu. He's fixing the problem that there's nothing at all that's ordered. But then there's no life in those things. So the second set of 3 days is where God is putting the life into the environments that he has then made. So the tohu va bohu is kind of structuring our entire first chapter of Genesis. And it's these first 7 days of creation is overcoming the problem that we have in the tohu va bohu. And there's a reason that the waters are there, that the deep is still there. But the deep is not something that is the personified evil. It's not a character that God is doing anything with. And I would personally argue that we tend to read this and we think, well, God made everything happen. Like, this is our idea of creation out of nothing. So he made everything out of nothing, and then suddenly it's all chaotic. So why did he make chaos? I actually think there's a better way to look at that. Because, first of all, the ancient person would not have been thinking about creation out of nothing until round about the Greek era. That's when they're thinking in terms of nothing versus something. But in the ancient world, it wasn't that dichotomy. It wasn't nothing versus something. It wasn't nothing versus something now exists. It was order and chaos, order and disorder. So God started with something that was disordered. And my contention is the reason for that would be because that thing is not God. It's not perfect. So, of course, it's not going to be ordered. And this is part of what this is why he's creating. This is what he's doing in our lives, in creation as a whole. He is making something that is not him to be something that is approaching him. Like, that's why we have the incarnation. I mean, not the only reason why we have the incarnation, but God was always intending to join himself with creation, and he was always intending for creation to move towards him and his glory. So it's not that, and you see, the pagan literature, it's always the deity or a thing that is chaos, right? It's a material aspect of the world. I don't think that's actually what we see in the Bible. It's like chaos is the opposite of God. It's the opposite of order. So chaos isn't just this thing that God manifested. It's something that exists because there's a process that God is doing from one point to another point. That's why we have creation. We have things that happened up until Christ, and then we have things that happen from Christ till the eschaton. And that's when everything is going to be actually perfectly ordered. But it takes all of that time, and we're like, why is it taking all of this time? Why does God do that? Well, we're here because God does that. Like, if he didn't take his time, we wouldn't all be here. So I think we should be glad that God is using a process. And And this is why he is sovereign. This is why he is worthy of worship, because he is our creator and he has all of the best interests in mind for everyone and for creation as a whole, and it's all going to be accomplished. We're going to get there in the end. And that's not something that we have to worry about, but we get to participate in that because we are God's imagers, and that's what we're supposed to be doing. Like, that's how we were created in Genesis 1. That's, I don't know. I think that's amazing.
It is. It is. I agree. In my research of these words, tohu would mean traditionally a desert or a waste. Many translators suggested formlessness, confusion, unreality, emptiness, or nothingness. These describe chaos, if we can summarize in just one word. Some scholars assume the existence of a watery chaos in Genesis 1 2. Bohu in Arabic would mean to be empty, or in Akkadian would mean emptiness or famine. Now, when it comes to the whole that term, not just tohu or not just vabohu, but the whole expression tohu vabohu, which is usually translated in English without form and void, you quoted Jeremiah 4 rightfully, as many scholars do, because they say that's the only other passage in the Old Testament or in the whole Bible where we see this expression, and it's not nothing. It's not nothing. It just simply means that there is darkness, there is this desert, the deep. They give all these words in Hebrew, which yeah, I will not even try to read, like Hoshek, Tehom, and others. Um, but basically, it's without form and void in both of these places, but it's not nothing. It just means that it's not inhabitable. Maybe yet, maybe it will never be, if that's a sort of God's judgment, but still it doesn't mean nothing. According to David Tsumura, Jeremiah 4:23-26 also means tohu vabohu, like Genesis 1 2, but in Jeremiah it means a desert like state of the earth, or not being productive. And I like this is why I love theologians. This is why I always go to the sources. This is why whenever I talk with people about some theological topic, I always like to know if they're quoting a scholar or just their opinion when they read the Bible, or maybe they Google them, like, boom, I did research. What kind of research did you do? Do you mean, did you go to the library? Did you buy some books? Did you read some scholarly articles from academia, edu, or elsewhere? Or did you just Google? Because these type of research processes are very different. This is why I always rely on scholars. That doesn't mean they don't make mistakes and they don't err. Of course they do, but the context they provide brings clarity in anything we study when it comes to the Bible. Thus, Genesis 1 2 probably means not terrible or deserted wilderness, but the earth was not being yet normal or productive for life again. This is what Tsumura is saying, David. And I agree with all the scholars I've been reading and assessing, so I could prepare the outline and the material for tonight. Maybe I'm biased, and we all are to a certain degree, but I like this color the most when it comes at least to this topic. Basically, Earth was lifeless, and I think I won't say it's not a coincidence, because nothing in God's word is coincidence. But we see this process of creation. We see the Earth not being not existing, but it's still not inhabitable. There's still not life. There's still not the circumstances were not good for people yet. And then you see the Spirit of the Lord hovering there. And we see also in the New Testament, where there is the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom, there is life, there is all these things. There's not the process of being born again and adopted into the family of God without the Holy Spirit. So we see this role of the Holy Spirit in both testaments, how he's there where there's death, when there's chaos, when there's darkness, when there's just lifelessness, if I can use that term. And there's the Spirit of the Lord. It doesn't say, but I can only imagine, and this is biblical, and I want you to give me your input. He's working, he's bringing life, He's the one, like in Ezekiel, bringing life to those dead bones, right? In the valley of the dead bones. He's the one doing work because the Holy Spirit is God, right? So, what is this about the Spirit of the Lord? Because he's not credited or described much with work in Genesis, yet like I said, this is not a coincidence. The Spirit of the Lord was hovering above the earth, which was lifeless.
Absolutely. Like we tend to think of when we're born again, we we connect that to my sins are washed away, which yes, absolutely. But there's also the idea of life. Like we are given a new life. We are now new creations. So it's a very direct parallel to what's going on in Genesis. And so if our concern is almost entirely about sin and, well, now I better not sin and now I better do better in all of these things, yeah, I mean, you should, please do, but like there's more to it. Like when we think of the idea that we are given life and the structure of life is thrives in ordered environments. And when it's not just that we shouldn't sin and that sin is bad, it's that disorder is also bad. It's that the lack of thriving life is also bad, and there are things that we can individually do in our lives and in our families and in our societies, in our local areas, to promote life. And that is working in God's order and creating via the spirit in us. That's the only reason we're able to actively accomplish those things. It's not that, well, we just better pull up ourselves by our bootstraps and get this done. No, it's God working in us for his purposes of creation. So yeah, I think that really looping the idea of chaos into our thinking and seeing, oh, my life is chaotic. How can I better order that? That's doing God's work. That those seem small things to us. But when we organize our lives and we make a better household situation for our children, or we're doing something for the world to make it a prettier place. We're doing yard work to make it ordered, and people can now enjoy that. Like those things, I think they're just as much a part of living into us being God's imagers as other things that we might think are more grand. So that's why I think that really digging into this topic of chaos and seeing that it is connected to ordering our world and God using us for that. He is defeating chaos through humanity, ordering our world by being indwelt by the Spirit and giving life to things around us. Like that's part of this whole idea.
Yes. Another passage which scholars like to assess when it comes to this biblical topic of chaos in Genesis 1, it's not just Genesis 1 2. Genesis 1 2 is the primary one. But they also like reading and assessing Genesis 1:10. Now, if you would ask someone like me, who even went to the biblical school, if I would read Genesis 1:10 in English, I would see nothing wrong. I would just read it probably in 2 seconds and continue reading. I'll read it now and then I'll just say what scholars are saying. So Genesis 1:10, God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Okay, so when it comes to Genesis 1:10, it describes seas as in Hebrew yamim, and in verse 21 we also see great sea creatures and monsters as taninim. Again, these are the similar words which pagans are using for their gods and goddesses. And this, according to some scholars, not all, but to some scholars, this can cause I wouldn't say theological anxiety, but this can cause them to think, oh, this is another example where the Hebrews borrowed the same ideas, from their neighbors. just because of similarity in words. However, when we read the whole chapter of Genesis 1, we see that Genesis chaos was not evil. Actually, God made it. I have a bunch of reference cross references like Psalms 95, Psalm 95, Psalm 04, Psalm 146, Proverbs 8, Isaiah 40. For everyone who likes to go deeper, that you can take notes. In these passages, you can compare God's chaos and God's waters, and you can see that actually in Genesis 1:10, like we heard the verses finished that, and God saw that this was good. If there was really a chaos with whom God had to wrestle and try to defeat, if this was like a heavenly colosseum or something like that, right? We don't see nothing like that in Genesis 1, unlike some pagan narratives, because this chaos, so to speak, is completely under God's control. And waters are good. Waters are not here as the enemy. Waters are not here to try to fight God, or maybe kill humanity that is about to show on the face of the earth. Actually, waters are serving God's purpose. Is this also what you found in your own research?
Yes, the the nuance I would put on that is that as long as they're staying where God put them, it's the boundary crossing of things that causes problems. When the sea is not staying where God put it, and it is not behaving the way it should because it's rebelling against God, then that's a bad thing. And that's the theme. I mean, again, I'm personifying sea here, but that's because the idea of boundaries can apply to both beings who have, mental capacity to rebel or not, as well as nature. And here we see God is completely in control. He is putting the boundaries that he wants to have there. And he's able to do that without a fight. He doesn't have to struggle to do it. He's like, see, you go over there, land, here you are. And now suddenly everything is good because there is a boundary put into place where we have the ability eventually for humanity and things. We're not going to live very long if there's no land. So that's a very important boundary that God's putting in.
Yeah, I also like how in one of his chapters, David Tsumura summarized. He says, "Hey, this is the conclusion. Genesis 1, and one of the and all the passages which I just mentioned in the last few minutes, like Proverbs 8, Psalm 104, and others, they do not have this Chaoskampf motive. They do not. You can assume they do, but they do not. God is actually, like I said, sovereign over the waters. We see this in Genesis. We see this in Exodus with God, where God was dividing the Red Sea. We see this when God is defeating Leviathan, a sea serpent. We see this basically throughout the Bible, that waters are not something that is, it may be untamable by someone like me and you, but is completely in control under Yahweh. But not just that, it serves his purposes for good and for evil. Whatever he plans to do with his creation, he's more than able to do. Um, but also, this is amazing. Jesus being God. Now, I know we are going to the New Testament just for time being. We see in Mark 4 and in Mark 6 how Jesus comes and he's now subduing nature because he's God, right? He's Yahweh in flesh. He's walking among the people. They're like, who is this dude, right? With all this authority, he's like walking and subduing this gods of nature, gods of seas, gods of winds, and like all these ancient deities supposedly that others pray to. They had to cut their own flesh so they can call upon these gods. So these gods would supposedly pay attention to. Jesus doesn't do any of these things. He's actually walking towards his his disciples, trying not to you know bring anxiety among them, but they're like, oh, this is ghost, who is this person that is doing these things, right? So we see, like I said, in the Gospel of Mark, Mark 4 and Mark 6, how Jesus first calms the sea and then he walks on water. If this is not a prime example in the New Testament of Jesus' authority as Yahweh in flesh over these chaotic, I won't say beings, but these chaotic forces slash fallen beings who thought they have some authority over these, parts of nature or life. I don't know if we can find better examples. So these bring so much delight, knowing and confidently knowing, like, hey, this is the dude whom I serve, this is my Lord and Savior. So can we please just expand on these passages from Mark 4 and 6?
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's amazing. Like, so, you say we're not personifying those things, but the people would have seen the connections. They would have connected them intimately. There were beings who had supposedly authority over those things. And Jesus is just out there, just walking all over it like it's nothing. And it, again, it's not, he didn't have to take a sword and go and fight the waves. He just walked out there because he could. There's no battle there. There's no struggle there. But people would have known that that's what he is doing, is showing his authority there. And yeah, so I remember when I was little, we would hear the story of Jesus walking on water, and it's this idea. To me, it was like, oh, look, this is a miracle. I can't walk on water. Jesus can walk on water. So that's the difference. That was the difference in my mind, right? It was showing that there was a miracle. Why it was water and why he had to walk on it, I had no idea. Like, I didn't have any of those associations with chaos in my mind when I was younger. Like, I had no idea that the original authors would have thought, look at Jesus being the authority over these other fallen gods. And once I see that, I go, oh, it's not just another miracle. It was an indication of his deity. So it's not that, he just some parlor trick. Like, it was so much more than that. And the depth of meaning there is just incredible once you look at it and once you start seeing these. And I guess that's one reason I really like biblical studies, is you get to know these things that you've maybe read dozens of times and you've heard the story a dozen times, but looking at it with that slightly new nuance, you go, oh, I see. And it's just so cool.
I didn't think about asking this question, but it just comes to my mind, so I have to ask. Do you think that in the same fashion as in Christ, God gives us authority over demons, which are called scorpions and snakes, metaphorically elsewhere? Do you think that in that fashion, when Peter said, when Peter is asking Jesus to give him basically authority to walk upon the waters, do you think that maybe I'm trying to see what is not there, but do you think spiritually looking behind just what was happening in the natural realm, do you think spiritually, in a way, Jesus was bestowing his authority on Peter to walk upon these false deities and gods which were trying to tame the nature, but then Jesus came and showed them who is the big boss. And then look, not just he's the big boss, but he's giving one of his, I won't say minions, but one of his disciples can actually also defeat these gods. Do you think there is this spiritual warfare in that little part of the story where Peter tries to walk on the water?
Definitely. I think we see that. And of course, Peter gets afraid. And, well, what does that mean? and we look at Peter's life, and he has all of these ups and downs, right? Like he's riding really high and he's doing real well, and then suddenly we're like, come on, Peter, really? What? Why did you have to be like that? Or so he's got this up and down kind of progression to his storyline in the New Testament, which is fascinating because you'd think that Peter, we think of him as being one of the closest people to Jesus, and if anybody could have done and should have done and would have known and could have known, it would have been Peter. And yet we see him failing all the time. And yet, every single time, what happens? God reaches out and lifts Peter up, even in spite of all of that. So I think that there's this idea of the authority for sure. I think there's the theme of Peter's just life trajectory that we could see, and we can also see ourselves in that as well, because if I mean, not that we are all just like Peter, and not that we are but there's the idea that we are also given authority because we're in Christ. And so what are we going to do with that? Are we going to trust God? Are we going to keep our eyes on him and keep walking forward? Are we going to get afraid? And you know what? Even if we do, which we will, we fail, we're going to get afraid, we're going to not trust God like we should, but God still reaches out, and God's still getting his missions and things accomplished. It's this progression of learning and discipleship that we are all on. If Peter had to be on a path of discipleship, then what about us? We don't walk daily with Jesus physically present next to us. We're not eating fish with him daily, but we go into our churches, and we partake of the Lord's Supper, and that's part of eating with Jesus. So, I think that when we see these things, then we can really say, what does that mean for the life of the disciple? And how can I be a better disciple looking at these stories? Like, yeah, I think that's a pretty cool thing to be bringing out.
Yeah, for sure. I also like in his sovereignty how well, but also in his majesty, how the scriptures are calling the sea to praise the Lord. We see this in Psalm 148. Sea creatures are called taninim in the same fashion as this Hebrew word is used in Genesis 1:21 as the sea creatures. Again, this is another parallel with paganism, but in this sense, these sea creatures are not they're not malevolent, they're not evil, they're all subdued to God. So there's only similarity in the word. That's it. We also see in Psalm 96 where she is called Yam. Again, this would be a pagan goddess, but in the Bible it's not pagan goddess, it's just sea, which, like you said, better than me, could be used in good or in good purposes or bad purposes, but it still is God's purposes. It's not out of God's control. We also see this in Psalm 98:4. Another example, so the sea is urged to give praise to God. It's not fighting God. It's not disobedient. This is not Satan, right? It's nothing like that. Actually, I like how again, David Tsumura, he assesses in great lengths, and he says that Yam, which is sea or the pagan goddess, does not even appear in Genesis 1:2. So it's wrong to assume that there's this goddess with whom Yahweh is wrestling in Genesis 1:2. This word Yam appears in Genesis 1:20. So now Tsumura concludes that he says, therefore, it is difficult to assume that an earlier Canaanite dragon myth existed in Genesis 1:2. There is no evidence that Tehom in Genesis 1:2 is the personification of an original Canaanite deity, as John Day assumes. Tehom is Tiham, ocean or water, part of the earth made by God. There's no, again, I love creepy things. I like scary things. I like supernatural. I like, to get lost and visualize stuff. But I also like getting biblical and scholarly and academic. And I believe wholeheartedly, if I can say, what Tsumura comes to in his research in the book he writes. Yes, God can use chaos in every way he desires. For example, as we know this in the Bible, God turned Babylon into chaos, which is Jeremiah 51. Uh, he's turning it into a desolation without inhabitant or waste, because this is God's judgment. God also turned Egypt into chaos. Ezekiel 29. It's called the wilderness, because God says to Egypt, I will give you as food. This is also a picture of chaos. The chaos sea is also designation for Assyria in Isaiah 17, or is designation for, again, for Babylon in Habakkuk 3, and so on and so on. This is just the examples how chaos does not necessarily have to be evil. And again, it's never combating God. It will never prevail. It serves God's purposes, and it shows how not only that chaotic waters have to give praise to God, just like every other part of nature and creation, but it also, God will turn his enemies into something like chaos, into wilderness, into places which will not be in they will not be dwelled by people. Sometimes we even go and see in the Old Testament as even further step of judgment, if I can put it that way. Okay, this place will be so desolate, there won't be people among you, but there will be some, like you said, screeching owls, there'll be some foxes, there will be some hyenas, there'll be some weird, creepy, wild animals, as even, if I can add an extra layer of chaos, because it means, hey, beware, you should not go to live there, because I'm judging this place. Because as see we throughout the Bible, God would always give time even to pagan nations in his mercy to repent. And if they would not come to repentance, God would send whomever he wants to use, sometimes even other pagans, or the Jews, or the nature, or the angels, who will come and destroy them. So this is the beautiful conclusion when it comes to the chaos, how it can be used as God's powerful tool to punish the enemy. Would you agree with this conclusion, both by Tsumura and what I said?
Yeah. So I'm thinking about what you're talking about, and we've been talking about chaos. We've been talking about the theme and bringing up this idea of judgment. So I think what you can see is that chaos is here at the beginning of Genesis. And I've been looking through Revelation and wondering, obviously, there's many places that you can find chaos in Revelation. You have the lack of the sea, and you have the dragon in Revelation 12. Uh, but when you think of the fact that chaos is also connected with judgment, I think you can really see it at the very end of the book of Revelation, where you have the curse of the people. If you add to the book, a curse is a type of chaos. Like you are being uh, you are not able, it's a threat to your fertility or continued life in some way. That's what a curse is. So from the beginning to the end, we see that chaos is, we think of it as bad, but God is using it for his own purposes. Like that's fascinating to me. Did you mention what book this was by Tsumura? I don't know if you actually gave the title for people.
Yeah, you're right. It's called Creation and Destruction. And also, I have all these books, which I covered most of them, but I also couldn't find time in 1 week to cover Tsumura and other four books. But I plan to give links even to John Day's book, with whom I don't agree about everything, or I didn't benefit necessarily, because I said he doesn't seem that much, and this is my biasness, as maybe as conservative theologian like some other guys. But I plan to include all five Amazon links to these books at the end of the channel. I will edit the episode description, and I will put all the title for the books for people who want to learn more.
Yeah, I think that's really useful for people, and I think a lot of those books you have, they're pretty good for getting into the theme and trying to see it, and just help us study our Bible better.
Yeah, you know what's funny? Before we started going live, we said, "Oh, we'll do this. We will do this topic in 2 episodes because it will take us 4 or 5 hours to finish everything." We're almost 2 hours and we are done, close to be done. Not done, but close to be done. So I don't know if I should be excited or bummed because I was looking also forward for the next episode about chaos. But at least for today, I believe we can finish everything at once. I also wanted to mention from my notes that the sea can be evil, right? This is not something that is illogical. We see this in real life. People get drowned, they get killed in the sea. Um, we see these examples in the Bible. I have Psalms like 18, 46, 69, 74, like with the Red Sea or sea monsters. Some other psalms like 77, 89, 93, and so on and so on. Like, yeah, sea is literally troublesome, and because it's so deep, and like there are tsunamis and waves, it can kill you, but it can also be given as a metaphor for something that is prevailing and coming to kill us or threaten us. What can happen with these things? Like, are the waters really coming not just around our ankles but maybe close to our necks, and threatening our lives? Kiri, I would like to finish for today with this subsection when it comes to a very positive and very hopeful subtopic and idea, the end of chaos. That's how I named it. Namely, we see in Psalm 74:14 and in Isaiah 27:1, Leviathan, right? In Romans 16:20, Paul is saying that the same way, like in Psalm 74 and Isaiah, God will slash this ancient sea serpent, Leviathan. Paul is saying in Romans 16 that God will soon crush Satan under your feet, talking to the church in Rome. Also, we see in 2 Peter 2 and in Jude, I was about to say Jude 1, but Jude has only one chapter. In Jude verses 4 and 12 to 13, there is judgment of the fallen angels, which are also a type or a form of chaos. And at the very end, we see in Revelation 21:1, there will be sea no more. And like we said, according to the teaching of our beloved late scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser, who was the first one who introduced me with the idea that the sea represents chaos, and which also you mentioned at least once before. Um, the sea does represent chaos, and there's this overwhelming hope in both testaments. Hey, God will stop chaos. God will stop the enemy, be it chaotic waters, sea serpent, Satan as the main or the arch enemy of God, being maybe the fallen angels, which we see since Genesis 6 until 2 Peter 2 or Jude. We see this hope that God is coming, and he's not just coming to judge, he is coming to judge, but in this judgment, because he's the victorious one, he's the God of gods, he's the Lord of lords, in the most literal sense, he will come and say, no more, no more. You had all this time, you had all this um, um, maybe even authority they had, but they abused, and they were killing people. They're slaying the prophets, the apostles, the martyrs throughout the church history, but also in the history of the Old Testament. And God is saying, God is coming with his sword. I don't know if it will be a physical sword or maybe sword more like his word or whatever that sword is, but God is coming to slay the ancient serpent, Leviathan, or the Satan. How hopeful is this for the global church? What do you think?
Oh man, that's so amazing, and it is God working, but and I don't have this pulled up, so I don't have a reference, but I'm pretty sure it's in Revelation where there's the actual battle, and it's not God battling. It's the archangel Michael and other angelic beings. So God is absolutely sovereign, but he's okay using his created creatures, whether it's the angels and the spiritual beings or whether it's us. And we are part of that defeat of chaos, which I think is rather incredible. Um, and and I kind of want to ask you, do you think that the serpent in Genesis 3, do you think he is the same as this theme? Is he like the serpent, like he's not in the sea, but he is a serpent. So, do you think he's the same as the chaos dragon?
You put me on the spot. Um, Without going deep into research of this topic, I would say they have a lot of similarities. But yeah, one is the sea dragon and one is the land dragon. Now, are these related in the fashion or in the meaning of sharing the same antichrist or diabolical spirit? Yes. Do they look the same? I don't know. Is their purpose the same or similar? Probably, when it comes to, like Jesus said, the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So I think I don't think that because we see in the Old Testament promise in the eschaton, the coming age, that the cobra will lie with some, with people, or like with more tame animals. There'll be, there'll be sheep and wolf, there'll be lions and this. So if snake is necessarily naturally evil being, there will be no cobras in heaven. Now we can say, well, this is just a metaphor, meaning that God's arch enemies can be changed, or maybe that in natural what we see as evil or dangerous, like wolves and lions, there will be no animosity between different species in heaven. I'm open for that interpretation. But if there will be literally cobras or any type of animals in heaven, we see then that snakes are not inherently evil. Rather, we may see that the same Python spirit, which is mentioned in the Book of Acts, which was used to possess and take that sorceress lady who was like good with guessing. I forgot the proper word, which was her title, the fortune teller, right? So maybe we can say, well, there's this serpentine-like diabolical spirit which takes form of certain animals, and they may be called different animals. They may come from different groups of types of species of animals, but it's the same behavior when it comes to killing, destroying, deceiving, lying. Um, that's my best answer so far, but I wouldn't necessarily know if the land and the watery serpent are the same creature, because the enemy at the end shows to have multiple heads, like Hydra. Maybe it's the same enemy with different heads. I mean, I don't know, but that's a good topic and it's a good question.
Yeah, I find it just really interesting to think about and to see what other people think about. Like, because we can make these connections and we can talk about them, but, how closely can we really equate one thing to another? And we do need to be really careful with that, not just go crazy with all of the connections, right? But at the same time, it is the patterns and the themes that we should be paying attention to. So I just find it really interesting.
So wait, Carrie, are you saying that not every woman whom we dislike, we're supposed to call Jezebel? You know how you encounter people from churches, oh, that's a Jezebel. I'm like, wait, okay, why? It's like, explain this to me. Like, they don't like certain women because she may be nasty or gossiping, or maybe even have this sexual freedom. To be like, that's a Jezebel. I'm like, okay, just chill. Maybe she is. I don't know, but like, just be slow with those judgments. Like, how do you know? Like, yeah, sometimes I think it could be so easy to perceive and to discern, but not always. So yeah, I agree with this. But Carrie, this was a phenomenal episode. It lasted shorter than I thought, like, unfortunately, but that's okay because I'm gonna study more books and write more outlines for our future chats, because I honestly always enjoy talking with you, because you have masters in biblical studies, and we're always drawn to, well, not always, but we tend to be drawn to similar topics, because in this same season of your podcast, you've been studying about chaos, and then I come and say, hey, Carey, would you like to talk about biblical chaos? And it's like, it's so amazing how in the same time God is using our brains and minds to like study and talk about same topics. This doesn't happen with regular people. I cannot go and talk with my friends, hey, do you want to like they'll be like, are you nuts? And to a certain point I am, but I mean, still, I would like to talk about some vague and, creepy and weird ideas. This is what actually I shouldn't be embarrassed of, because again, Dr. Heiser taught us that if something is weird, it's important. And I just wish more pastors and more theologians are assessing these very important topics, but they either shy away, or they think it's irrelevant, or maybe very controversial, and they don't want to teach their people, be it in academia or in church, about these things. But I think these things just, and these topics, and these scholars, even with whom we disagree, I wholeheartedly believe they just help us to see the beauty of the Bible and the complexity. And by using these tools of biblical theology to grasp Bible at least 1% more after studying topic after topic, and then to see how much amazing there is this theme from Genesis to Revelation, how God is putting everything perfectly in order, which I know some people like to say, well, the Bible has been edited and copied so many times and all these things. Yet we see all these perfect progression and perfect cross references and matches from beginning to the end, as God using people to write the Bible, correct? But He's that capital A author of the scriptures, and that's for me, it's amazing. Carey, do you have any concluding thoughts for our viewers when it comes both to this amazing topic of biblical chaos, but also in general, maybe encouraging people to buy more books and read, anything like that?
Oh, we can always buy more books. But yeah, what's interesting to me is that sometimes you will get into a topic like this and you'll think, oh, it's very niche. It's very kind of, it's looped into certain images, and those are really useful and those are helpful. And, that helps you see the Bible, but, you can take it or leave it. You don't really need to have that in your life in order to really understand the Bible. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes there's topics that, it's just kind of interesting and it's very helpful for understanding the biblical author and understanding the context of the time, and really getting those pictures into your head. And that just in and of itself, completely worth it to do these kinds of studies. But I also think that a lot of these things are very much more deeply embedded into the story of salvation than we realize, which means that it's connected to the work of the Messiah. It means it's connected to the life of the disciple. It means it's connected to what we should be doing here on earth. And that's what I see in this theme, honestly, is we look at the dramatic pictures of the fights and the struggles and the dragons and all of that stuff. But then we can also like take that down into what we are actually dealing with in our lives, and saying, well, I we don't always feel like we're doing grand things. We don't always feel like that, oh, I'm supposed to be in ministry, I'm supposed to be evangelizing. I always feel like I should be doing so much more for God, when we don't see all of the little things that we're doing in life that help to order and bring life to ourselves and those around us. And that also is the work of God, because God is a God of order and not a God of chaos, and He will absolutely bring even the smallest bits of our chaos into His order. And that's what I'm really zoning into when I look at this theme. Like, I love the big pictures because it helps me to see the smaller pictures in my life and to see what those actually play out and what that means. Like, what is the purpose of life, and why did God come into the creation for us? It's more than just sin management. It is entire purposes of creation, and that's what I love to dig into.
And that's so beautiful that God chose a no one like me to make me someone in his image so that I won't be no one anymore, but someone precious. Not because I did something wonderful, even though I think I daily do wonderful things, but because only and just only in his work. And that is amazing. When I talked, I didn't plan mentioning this, but when I have discussed uh, recently with three guys who approached me at my work who tried to emphasize so much Sabbath and that you are not saved if you're not following 10 commandments, like almost blindly, especially when it comes to Sabbath. Then they came with all these conspiracy theories with the Council of Nicaea and Emperor Constantine changing Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday and all these crazy ideas. I saw even more, and also recently listening to some testimonies of former Muslims who converted to Christianity. I see one similar pattern in both of these Sabbath keeping people. And I'm not against Sabbath keeping people, but if you keep Sabbath for salvation and if you break it, you're doomed to hell, then that's a problem. So I see the same pattern in these people who were former Muslims and these people who would say that if you don't follow Sabbath, you may go to hell. Man, I see so much work, emphasis on yourself, so much stress. I wouldn't be able to live my life as a Christian knowing that my salvation depends on me, knowing that today I didn't pray enough, I didn't read enough, I didn't give enough, I didn't rest enough, I didn't love enough, I didn't do gazillion other things because it's always do, 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 do. And I, just like everyone else, keep failing, but on the other side see Jesus and his finished work, and I can rest on that knowing that he accepts me the way who I am, and he doesn't want to leave me who I am. He wants to change me, keep transforming me into the likeness of his son, of Jesus. And that's where my confidence, that's where my peace and rest is, because I'm in him. He's using no one's to be someone's, and to start a channel, to start a ministry like this, and to try to fill in the gaps with the material what is missing in churches and in academia nowadays, not trying to bring division or controversy for the sake of division or controversy, but trying to help people with their difficult but very good intellectual theological questions that not many people can answer. So in that spirit, Carey, thank you so much from having this couple of hours for the all the viewers of the channel, for myself. My nerd level just went up. I learned from you. I learned from these scholars. Whenever I learn, I'm as happy when I spend time with good books and with people who are similar to me, like yourself. I'm happier than some people like going spending money. They go like eating food in restaurants. I This is what actually make me joyful, and especially knowing that this digital content, all these videos will be available there online for people to come for a long time, and hopefully it will bless them and teach them. And as one of the purposes of the channel is to bring people to Christ who are new believers or skeptics, but when it comes to the people who are already in faith, to strengthen their faith and to understand, hey, it's okay if you have questions, it's okay if you have doubts, it's okay if you don't understand. There's so many things we don't understand. That's why we buy books, that's why we read articles, that's why we have this late at night videos and YouTube live chats, so we can try to dig into some of the things and come up with solution. So Carey, thank you so much for your time and for all this information. I would just, for the very end, would like to remind all the viewers, please keep praying for us because we struggle so much attacks with so much things that you have no clue. We also appreciate every time you share the link, you subscribe, you like, you put some kind comment. This helps the algorithm, so this channel will eventually start being promoted little by little. And also, like I said in my video, which I did by myself 2 days ago, uh, we just got Daniel as the visual uh, department head of that department, who will be redoing the whole video and photo editing. He's not asking for any money, but whatever you contribute in the coming season will be going to him. And I just want to bless our brother and help him. So again, thank you all for your time and for your patience and for love and support for the channel. I wish you a blessed Sunday. And for next Sunday, I have planned with my ministry partner, Joshua Davidson, to do something else, but I will not say yet what.
Ooh.
So yes,
That's where the mystery comes in.
Yeah, this is what mystery, the first M of the channel comes, right? Yeah, actually
Yeah.
the second M. Well, thank you all of you. Have a blessed week, and I'll see you next Sunday. Take care.
Thank you.